This man, who spent 25 years in prison, claimed to have turned his life around and spoke about prison reform on a recent Joe Rogan podcast. But only 1 month after that video aired, he was arrested after police found dismembered body parts in his freezer. People are shocked but also intrigued with Sheldon's story because he deceived all the viewers into thinking that even though he went to prison for attempted murder and robbery, he had actually turned his life around. But that was not the case at all, and this man's life took a really dark turn. So let's talk about it. I'm going to go way back with the story so you guys can understand a little bit more of who Sheldon Jr. is and where he came from. And get ready because this story is insane. Sheldon Johnson Jr. comes from generations of drugs, gangs, and imprisonment. It all started with his father, Sheldon Sr., who was addicted to heroin and crack cocaine when Sheldon was only a baby. Because of his addiction, Sheldon Sr. ended up abandoning his family, which consisted of Sheldon Jr., his sister, and their mother. Sheldon Sr. ended up getting deeper into drugs. He was constantly in trouble with the law and ended up having kids with multiple women. It's even been said that in 1986, Sheldon Sr. R'd a 7-year-old girl 3 times, but he was given 0 prison time and instead was only given 5 years of probation, which that is disgusting and ridiculous. But not long after, he was arrested when police caught him buying cocaine, but then was released, and then he was arrested again for the same thing. So basically, Sheldon Sr. was in and out of prison constantly. And during this time, his son, Sheldon Jr., who was growing up without his father, was also following his footsteps, except Sheldon Jr. was getting into deeper and bigger trouble than his father. Sheldon Jr. grew up in Harlem with his mother and his sister, and it was just the 3 of them. And they were very poor, especially since his mother could not work because she was actually deaf, and with their father not around, it was hard to make ends meet. But apparently, he was a good student until he started getting in trouble at school. He began fighting at school with other students, and one day when he was 10 years old, he sprayed his teacher with a fire extinguisher. And because of that, he was arrested and placed in a psychiatric ward where he was with other students who were also considered bad. He spent about 11 months in there, but he was fed up with the rules, and one day he ran away. Sheldon Jr. dropped out of school in the 6th grade, and then not long after, at the age of 10, he began working in the streets. He became friends with the wrong crowd, people who were a lot older than him, who introduced him to drugs, gangs, and basically that life. Sheldon Jr. began making a lot of money, and this is something he was never used to. Like I said, he grew up very poor, so now that he's making hundreds of dollars in one day, he wasn't going to just quit this life. Sheldon apparently climbed up the ranks in the streets pretty quickly, and according to one of Sheldon's street friends, he became reckless with everything. Sheldon was constantly getting into street fights with other gang members, and he was bringing all this unwanted attention to him and his friends. He was constantly arrested on drug-related charges and was in and out of prison just like his father, Sheldon Sr. But in 1994, this is when everything changed for Sheldon Jr. At only 19 years old, he was arrested for drug trafficking, kidnapping, and other felonies. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and during those 2 years, he had no way to collect his money from people that had bought drugs from him prior to him getting locked up. So then Sheldon asked his friends to collect his money for him in the meantime. But when his friends tried to, these people did not want to pay up. Apparently, they owed Sheldon Jr. about $5,000, and they said that they didn't want to pay because Sheldon was in prison and they thought that he wasn't going to get out. But they were wrong. So 2 years later, in 1997, Sheldon's case got dismissed and he was able to go home. The first thing he did was look for those people that owed him all this money. I mean, you'd think that someone coming out of prison after 2 years would want to change their life around and say, you know, maybe I should cut ties with these people. But no, Sheldon Jr. did not play when it came to his money. Sheldon began finding each person that owed him money, and he would rob them at gunpoint.
Then I come home and, I need my money. I need my money. It's just me being honest. This is me being straight. I gave you something, and we had an understanding that you were going to pay me. And when I came home, when I finally located this particular individual, he had his girlfriend with him. And this guy owed me $5,000 for some drugs that I had gave him.
And if they didn't have any money on them, then he would just take all their jewelry.
So I robbed him. And I took his jewelry. And his girlfriend happened to be there, and unfortunately, she got caught up in the situation. I had a bunch of young guys with me, and they robbed her as well. And he got hit in the head with the gun right here on the side of his head, and he got 2 stitches. And they gave me 25 years for that case.
Sheldon was arrested for armed robbery and attempted murder. And this all happened just 4 days before Christmas in 1997. So in a span of a few months, Sheldon was back to being locked up. And this time, the judge was over it. He felt like Sheldon deserved to be punished. So he sentenced Sheldon to 50 years in prison. Sheldon explains that he saw this as a life sentence. And at this point, Sheldon had already had his first child. He had a son, which he went on to name after himself and his father. So imagine, Sheldon Sr. was in prison when Sheldon Jr. was a baby. He didn't grow up with his father, and now that Sheldon Jr. is in prison, his son, who's very young, will not experience growing up with his father. So that's 3 generations of fatherless Sheldons. Anyways, while Sheldon Jr. is in prison serving his long sentence, he decided to cut all these ties with everyone who only brought him problems. He quit doing drugs and was focused in turning his life around. Sheldon Jr. said that what motivated him was his son, who was still very young. He didn't want to be like his father and wanted his son to have a good role model. Sheldon had a reality check once he was in prison, and he saw all these older inmates who were spending their entire life in prison, and he didn't want to be like them. He said that he feared growing old and dying alone. So from that point, Sheldon spent every single day trying to better himself and prove that he has changed. He got his GED, took some college courses, performed in a theater group. He read whatever he could find in the library, wrote essays, and basically became a model inmate according to the prison social worker. Eventually, 25 years later, the courts came to this conclusion that Sheldon Jr. was reformed, and it was safe to allow him to be a part of society again. On May 4th, 2023, Sheldon Jr. was released from prison. He moved on to work as an advocate for prison reform and also working with at-risk youth at the Queen's Defenders in New York. So Sheldon was working alongside lawyers, public defenders, and people in this area. And it's even been said that he was working very closely with high-profile figures such as the Manhattan District Attorney. So it's easy to say that Sheldon was on the right path to a better future. He began making a name for himself and also became a role model to many others who were also trying to turn their lives around. Now, this is where things get interesting. In February 2024, so literally last month, Joe Rogan released a podcast episode with Sheldon as a guest. And you guys know, everyone knows about Joe Rogan, so being on his podcast is a pretty big deal. Sheldon talked about everything in regards to his story and what he did to end up in prison. He emphasized on how he recognized his wrongs, and he talked about his path in being a better person.
As I moved on and I became more mature and I began to reevaluate myself, I realized how wrong that was.
He goes on to say that he had to make some conscious decisions to walk away from his previous life in order to improve his life. Sheldon also talks heavily on prioritizing rehabilitation for people accused of crimes instead of incarceration. So he's really inspiring in this episode. I mean, had I watched this podcast before knowing what I know now, I would think, wow, this guy really has changed. But in this podcast, he said something that I was kind of like, what? And I'm convinced that he spoke this into existence.
And when I got out, I made a decision that I was going to walk away. And I didn't care about what the consequences was. And I said to myself, I've been doing bad for so long, I'm going to try to do something good. If all else fails, I could always go back to doing bad.
Yeah, I don't know. Seems like things weren't actually going as great as we thought they were. So, only 1 month after this episode aired, police found dismembered body parts in his freezer in his apartment. This all began on March 5th, so literally this month. A resident from an apartment in the Bronx frantically called police when they heard screaming and someone pleading for their life, and they heard this person say, "Please don't, I have kids." And then 2 gunshots went off. When the officers arrived to do a wellness check, they knocked on the door of Unit 6G. This is where the residents believed that the commotion was coming from. And guess who opened the door? It was Sheldon Jr. They then looked inside of the apartment and found a foot and a torso in a black bin. And those human remains belonged to 44-year-old Colin Small. This apartment unit belonged to him, and it turns out that he was the one pleading for his life earlier that day. Surveillance footage was immediately checked out, and it turns out that he had entered his unit on that day, but he never came out. They then saw on surveillance that Sheldon entered Colin's unit, and then Sheldon left. Sheldon was then seen coming in and out of Colin's unit with cleaning supplies, garbage bags, and plastic bins. He was also seen constantly changing his clothes when he was coming in and out of Colin's apartment. There's also footage of him putting on a blonde wig at one point to disguise himself, but that obviously didn't work because the images are so clear, you know it's him. This is when investigators quickly zeroed in on Sheldon and searched his apartment. And they found Colin's head, legs, and arms stuffed inside his freezer. They quickly arrested Sheldon, and all Sheldon had to say was that he was innocent. Police allege that Sheldon shot Colin in the head and dismembered his body inside his own apartment. This story is like a mix of emotions because Sheldon went from being this bad guy to this good guy, and then he goes and does this. So apparently Colin and Sheldon knew each other from prison. They had spent some time together in this prison and then had a falling out after. We don't really know the details of what happened that led up to this. Sheldon was charged with murder, weapon possession, and concealment of a human corpse. He pled not guilty and is now being held without bail. This story is insane, and I mean, it really shows that some people just can't change their ways. Obviously, some people do change, but I feel like when things like this happen, it gives everyone else a bad rep. And people who knew Sheldon personally and saw how much he's changed were really shocked when they heard this news. It's hard to understand how someone spent 25 years in prison, was doing great, came out, was doing a lot of things to help other people, and then all of a sudden they do this. Something else I wanted to quickly mention is, remember when I said Sheldon Jr. had a son and he named him Sheldon as well? He was also in a lot of trouble with the law. It's been reported that he was charged with manslaughter at a very young age, but that's a whole other story. It's crazy to see how generation after generation the same thing keeps happening and there's no stop to it. What a crazy story. But that is it for today's video. This is a very recent thing that happened, so I wanted to share it with you guys and hear your opinions on it. Other than that, I would love if you guys can like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!